It was the summer of 1973 when I returned from Hanoi, my bones aching like rusted iron and my heart emptier than it had ever been before. Vietnam had taken so much from me. Brothers I'd never drink with again, nights I'd never sleep peacefully through, and worst of all, the future I'd once promised to Rebecca. She handed me her ring the day I shipped out. A plain gold band, warm from her fingers, which trembled only slightly as she pressed it into my palm. "Give it back when you're ready to come home to me," she said. I told her I would. I wore it in the inside pocket of my fatigues every single day, through monsoon rains and mortar fire, through sleepless watches and the ghostly quiet that follows a firefight. But the war ended. I came back. And the ring was still with me. The strange thing about coming home is that it never feels like home anymore. I stepped off the plane at Travis Air Force Base and looked out at a country I didn't recognize, where strangers passed without glancing up, where uniforms like mine drew scowls instead of salutes. The war had been on every TV screen, in every newspaper. People had made up their minds about it, and about us. I never told Rebecca I was back. For a long time I convinced myself I didn't know where to begin. But the truth? I was afraid. Afraid she'd moved on. Afraid I wouldn't recognize her either. And most of all, afraid I didn't deserve to. So the ring stayed in my pocket. And now, more than 30 years later, it still lives there, wrapped in an old handkerchief, tucked away in the drawer of a nightstand that groans like my conscience when I open it. There are nights when I take it out and hold it between my fingers, wondering what I would have said if I had only found the courage. What do you tell the love of your life when you return as a ghost of the man she once kissed goodbye? If this story touches your heart the way it touched mine to write it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. When I stepped back onto American soil, I thought there'd be some sort of stillness, some quiet breath of relief that I had made it out alive. Instead, I felt like I had landed on the wrong planet. San Diego shimmered under the July sun, but it didn't shine for us. Nobody was there to greet the C-141 that brought us home. No parades, no brass bands. Just a few buses idling near the tarmac, waiting to ferry us away like ghosts no one wanted to see. People looked through us. That's what I remember most. The way their eyes passed over my uniform, my face like I was an unwanted memory crawling back into the light. We didn't talk about the war back then, not in public, not in polite company. All those politicians who once told us we were fighting for freedom now walked past us like we carried shame in our boots. I took a cab to the neighborhood where Rebecca and I used to live. The streets were still there, but the feeling was gone. Like someone had rearranged the furniture of my life while I was away. The old corner florist, where she used to work summers between semesters, had been torn down. In its place stood a strip mall and a cracked asphalt parking lot where nothing bloomed. Her house, the house her parents left her before they moved to Arizona, still stood though. The shutters were painted blue now, not the soft green I remembered. I stood across the street for what felt like hours, just watching. It was quiet. There was laundry hanging on the line, a wind chime spinning lazily. I saw movement behind the curtain, but I couldn't move. My legs were rooted, heavy with the knowledge that too much time had passed. An old neighbor, Mr. Kaplan, stepped outside while I stood there frozen. He used to grill burgers in his driveway and wave at us when we biked by. He squinted at me, and for a second, I saw recognition flicker. "John?" he asked, voice thin with disbelief. I nodded. He came closer, glanced toward the house behind me. "She got married," he said, almost apologetically. "Maybe 5 years after you disappeared." Disappeared. That word landed like a stone in my chest. I hadn't disappeared. I had been taken, captured after the attack on Da Nang, listed as MIA for almost 3 years. I had been alive, barely, but cut off from every piece of my former life, and in that silence, life moved on. "Rebecca had waited," he said, "for a while. She tried to get answers, wrote letters to the Department of Defense, even went on the radio once, hoping someone might know something. But when nothing came, she broke. And someone else, someone from college, an old friend, was there to help her pick up the pieces. I thanked Mr. Kaplan and walked away before he could say anything more. The words were enough, more than enough. I didn't need to know what kind of man he was or whether he treated her right. I didn't want to see the inside of the house. All I could think about was that little gold ring still tucked inside my pocket, still warm from years of skin and memory. That night, I sat alone in a motel room on the edge of town, listening to traffic outside, the distant sound of trains. I held the ring in my hand and let it press into my skin like a bruise that would never heal. I thought about the things I should have said, the letters I never wrote, the hell I couldn't bring myself to describe. You see, war doesn't just take your time. It takes your voice, your future. It takes the courage you thought you had and leaves you with silence, because there are no words big enough to explain what it means to come back and find the world no longer has a place for you. And Rebecca, she had done the only thing she could. She kept living, built something out of the emptiness I left behind. I didn't blame her. I never did, but it didn't make it hurt any less. For weeks after that, I carried the ring everywhere I went. Took it out in diners, rest stops, park benches. I'd place it on the table in front of me and just look at it, like it might speak, like it might forgive me for not being faster, for not being enough. I didn't go back to the house. I couldn't. I told myself I was giving her peace, that it would only hurt more if she saw me now, this man she wouldn't recognize, carrying the ghost of the boy she once kissed beneath a 4th of July sky. But the truth is, I just couldn't face the look in her eyes. There were nights in Hugh when the air felt like a wet rag draped over your mouth, thick and heavy with rot and fear. The jungle was always alive, buzzing, chirping, rustling, whispering threats you couldn't see. We slept in short bursts, always with one eye half open, our rifles tucked beside us like anxious companions. But no matter how deep into enemy territory we went, no matter how far from anything human we seemed to be, I never let go of her ring. It lived in the inside pocket of my fatigues, wrapped in a handkerchief Rebecca had once tied around my lunch on a summer afternoon. I don't know why I chose to carry it. Maybe it was superstition, maybe something sacred, maybe it was all I had left that reminded me of who I used to be. When we were on patrol, surrounded by trees that looked like they might swallow us whole, I'd reach into that pocket and squeeze the ring like it was some kind of charm. Just the feel of the metal against my skin could make the gunfire fade for a second, could make me remember the smell of her hair, the way she touched my jaw when I was nervous before my deployment. But memory can be cruel. Jim, one of the guys in my unit, saw me fiddling with it once. He was from Montana, had freckles and a grin that made you think he'd be home before any of us. "You think she's really waiting?" he asked one night, when the sky was black as oil and the ground steamed from the day's rain. I didn't answer at first. I just looked down at the ring. "I have to believe she is," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was lying. The truth, I didn't know. I didn't know what time was doing back home. I didn't know if she still lived in the same house, if she still wore her hair in that braid, if she still played Simon and Garfunkel records on Saturday mornings. I wrote letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. I wrote them on scraps of paper, old C-ration boxes, the backs of maps. They were messy and smudged, filled with lines like, "I miss the sound of your laugh. I dreamt of your hands again. Tell me you still believe in us." But I never mailed them. Sometimes we didn't even have mail drops for weeks. Other times I'd sit with a stamped envelope in my hand and feel paralyzed. What if it got lost? What if someone else read it? What if I told her things she couldn't unhear? Things about the blood, the noise, the weight of a friend's body going limp in your arms. So I folded the letters and tucked them away. Rebecca never read a single one, and I never gave her the ring. The jungle didn't make space for tenderness. It was a place of survival, not sentiment. But still, On the worst nights, when we lost men, when I couldn't sleep, when the smell of gunpowder clung to my hair, and I could still hear the screams of someone calling out for their mother, I'd pull the ring from its cloth and look at it under the moonlight. It caught the light like a star, and for a brief, trembling second, I remembered who I was before everything went dark. There was one night we thought we wouldn't make it out. We were ambushed just before dawn. An explosion lit up the trees, and all I could hear was screaming and dirt hitting my helmet. Jim was hit in the leg. I dragged him behind a rock, held pressure on the wound while he cried and cursed. And all the while I kept thinking, if I die here, someone will find the ring. Maybe they'll know what it meant. Maybe she'll still get it back. Jim survived, barely. But something in him changed after that. He stopped talking about home. He stopped asking questions about who we used to be. And I stopped pretending I was going to send those letters. There was a night when the mist rolled in, so thick I couldn't see the man beside me. That was when I thought I heard her voice, Rebecca, calling my name softly, like a breeze through the bamboo. I followed it, half asleep, half mad, and stood alone in the trees, heart racing, ring clutched in my fist. Nothing was there. Just darkness. I never told anyone. They'd say it was malaria, stress, lack of sleep. And maybe it was, but I remember it still. Because in that moment, she felt real. In some strange way, the ring became my anchor and my burden. It was proof of the world I'd left behind, and a reminder of everything I might never get back. I wasn't the man she gave it to anymore. And the more days passed, the more I feared I never would be again, but I kept it. Through blood, through fire, through nights when I wanted nothing more than to forget her just so the ache would go away, because forgetting her, that would have been the final defeat. Years passed before I found out the truth. Not the kind of truth you hear in headlines or see in movies, but the quiet, personal kind, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone and never quite goes away. I was living out of my truck by then, moving from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to leave a shadow. Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico. I drifted through states like a man hoping to outrun his own reflection. It was in Tucson that I saw her sister, Emily. She was walking out of a bookstore downtown, arms full of paperbacks, her hair streaked with gray, but her face unmistakable. For a second, I didn't move. I just watched her, heart pounding, wondering if I should turn and vanish like I'd done so many times before. But she saw me. Her eyes widened, mouth parted like she'd seen a ghost. "John," she whispered. I nodded. We sat at a cafe on 4th Avenue, 2 cups of cold coffee between us. Emily couldn't stop staring. "We thought you were dead," she said. "Becca did. Everyone did. You vanished." I told her what little I could. About the prison camp. The months in the jungle, chained and starved, the rescue, the paperwork, the silence that followed me home like a second shadow. But even then I didn't say everything. Some truths are too raw to unwrap in front of anyone. And then she told me Rebecca was pregnant when I left. She didn't know yet. Just a few weeks along, she found out right after my letters stopped, right after the news came that I was missing. No one could find me. There were no updates, no status changes. The military listed me as MIA, but that didn't stop the world from moving forward. Rebecca tried to hold on. She wrote letters, contacted the Red Cross, pleaded for answers. But there was only silence. She gave birth to a boy in the spring of 1971, named him Daniel, raised him on her own for a while, living in that same old house, working double shifts at the hospital. Emily said she barely slept, that she kept the nursery door cracked open just in case I came home. But I never came. 3 years passed, and then an old college friend started showing up. Sam. He was kind, present, willing to be there in the ways I no longer could be. Eventually, Rebecca let him in. She married him. Not for love, at least not at first, but for security, for her son. I sat there frozen, every word tightening something inside me. A son. I had a son. Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a worn photograph. Rebecca on a porch swing, holding a toddler on her lap. His face, God, his face. He had my eyes. That same squint, the same left eyebrow that lifted when he smiled. "He's 23 now," she said. He thinks Sam is his father. He doesn't know about you. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All those years I'd carried that ring. All those nights I'd whispered her name like a prayer. I'd never known I was also carrying a secret this big. I wanted to scream. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry, to run, to collapse into the dirt and ask the sky why. But I just sat there, hands trembling, staring at a boy who looked like me and would never know who I was. Emily said Rebecca never forgot me, that even after she remarried, she kept a box under her bed with letters, photos, a dog tag. She told Daniel it was for someone she once knew, someone who'd meant a lot to her, but she never told him the truth. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she didn't want to break what she'd worked so hard to build. And who was I to come back and shatter it all? What do you do when life moves on without you? When the people you love the most have found ways to survive the silence you left behind? I thanked Emily and walked away that day without asking for more. I didn't ask where they lived. I didn't ask for phone numbers or addresses, because deep down, I knew I wasn't ready. I wasn't whole, and they deserved better than the broken version of me that wandered back into their orbit 2 decades too late. But that photo, I kept it, tucked it into the same pocket where the ring still lived. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I pull them both out, the ring and the picture, and wonder what might have been. I don't know how many times I drove past her house before I finally stopped. Emily had told me where she lived now, somewhere in the suburbs outside Sacramento, not far from the trails we used to hike when we were kids. The first few times I drove through the neighborhood, I didn't even slow down, just circled the block like a coward, heart hammering, palms sweating, afraid of what I might see or not see. Then one day, I parked across the street. I sat there for almost 2 hours. The house was quiet, modest, with a front porch wrapped in ivy and a small garden bed filled with marigolds. There was a flag on the porch and wind chimes that tinkled softly in the breeze. It looked like a good place, a peaceful place. And then I saw him. A man stepped out the front door, tall, broad shoulders, keys in hand. He looked exactly like the photo Emily had shown me, but older. His stride, the way he checked his watch, the set of his jaw, it was all familiar in a way that hurt. Daniel, my son. He walked to a car parked in the driveway, climbed in, and drove off. I didn't follow. I just watched him go, swallowed by a world I'd never be part of. And then she appeared. Rebecca. She came out with a watering can, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, wearing the same soft expression I remembered from so long ago. She knelt in the garden, tending the flowers, her movements gentle, practiced. The years had changed her, but not completely. She still moved like the woman I loved. Slow, steady, intentional. I held the ring in my hand, the one she gave me decades ago. The same one I carried through jungle and fire, through silence and shame. I rolled it between my fingers like a prayer. I could have gotten out. Walked across the street, knocked on the door. But I didn't. I stayed in the car, watching her through the windshield, my breath catching every time she turned slightly in my direction. What would I even say? I'm sorry I disappeared. I didn't know about him. I carried your ring all these years. Would that have been enough? Or would it have just reopened wounds she'd worked so hard to close? I remembered something Emily had said, that Rebecca had built a good life, that she loved her husband, even if it wasn't the love she and I once had, that she was proud of her son, that she smiled again. And I realized maybe the best thing I could do for her now was nothing. Maybe love, the kind that endures, sometimes means keeping a promise in silence. Not crashing back into someone's life to ask for pieces that no longer belong to you. Maybe it means respecting the distance they had to create just to survive. So I slid the ring back into my pocket. I watched her finish with the flowers, wipe her hands on a towel, and disappear into the house. I waited another 20 minutes just in case, though I don't know what I was waiting for. And then I turned the key in the ignition and drove away. I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew if I did, I might never leave. That night, I stopped at a rest area off the freeway and sat under a broken light with a cup of bad coffee. I took out the ring again and held it up to the sky. It shimmered under the pale glow like it always did. Still whole, still waiting. But this time, I didn't imagine slipping it back on her finger. I just sat there and let the weight of it settle into my palm. There are some things we carry forever, not because we're holding on, but because letting go would mean forgetting, and I never wanted to forget her. That was my last chance. I know that now. Not just to speak to her, but to give myself peace. To return something that was never mine to keep, but whether out of cowardice or reverence, I let the moment pass. Maybe that's what love looks like after all this time, knowing when to stay quiet. I live alone now in a cabin near Lake Tahoe, a quiet place, surrounded by pines that whisper when the wind pushes through them. It's not much, just a bed, a stove, and a view of the water that changes with every season. Some days, the lake looks like glass. Other days, like memory, choppy, dark, impossible to see through. This is where I've chosen to grow old, alone, but not empty. There's a small metal box in the drawer of my nightstand. Inside it, wrapped in the same cloth from Vietnam, is her ring. The one I never returned, the one I carried through hell and silence and decades of what-ifs. I don't take it out often anymore, but I know it's there, and somehow that's enough. I write letters sometimes, long ones, short ones. Some addressed to Rebecca, others to a boy named Daniel, who will never read them. I don't write for replies. I write because words have to go somewhere, and silence can only hold so much. People say time heals. I don't know if that's true. I think time just teaches you how to carry the weight without showing the strain. I never stopped loving her, not when I came back and couldn't knock on her door, not when I saw her in that garden, older, gentler, farther away than ever. I loved her when she gave me that ring. I loved her when I almost gave it back. And I love her still in this quiet, unseen way that asks for nothing and lingers anyway. Some kinds of love don't have endings. They just live on, tucked in drawers, folded in letters, whispered into night air when no one's around to hear. Rebecca was my promise, the one I couldn't keep, the one I never let go of. And though the world moved on, and she did too, some part of me stayed behind, with her in that garden, on that porch I never walked up to. I've learned that war doesn't only destroy with bullets and bombs. Sometimes it destroys with distance, with silence, with the pieces of you it takes and never gives back. But I also learned that love doesn't always need a witness. It can live quietly, patiently. Sometimes real love is knowing when to disappear. If I could speak to her now, just once, I'd say thank you for the summers, for the music, for the hope, for believing in a future that neither of us got to live, for giving me the ring that became my anchor, my ghost, and my truth, even if I never had the courage to give it back. We share new stories every day, true stories that move, inspire, and remind us of what it means to be human. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share your story. We're listening.